So I think we have several more people who are going to be joining us, but I always like to be respectful of people's time. And it's really my honor this evening to introduce Rabbi Meir Muller. Rabbi Muller has been working with our faculty over the course of this year, talking about how we can bring important ideas around race and racism to our children in developmentally appropriate ways that are in line with our core values and our mission. I want to give just a short introduction before I hand it over to Rabbi Muller. He has earned his rabbinical ordination as well as a doctorate in the area of early childhood education. He serves as an assistant professor in the College of Education at the University of South Carolina. His research interests include cultural relevant pedagogy, anti-racist pedagogy, constructivist theory, and Jewish early childhood education. In 2016, he was awarded the Early Childhood Teacher Educator Award by the National Association for Early Childhood Teacher Education. He has served as the lead author of South Carolina's Early Childhood State Standards and is a part of a team of educators developing curricula that prepare European teachers to address bias, prejudice, and anti-Semitism. He has over 30 years of experience as the head of school, and he works with faculties across the country. It is truly a blessing to be able to introduce Rabbi Meir. He is going to go ahead with a presentation. If you have questions or comments, please feel in the chat. I'm going to be monitoring the chat during his presentation, and I'll jump in and interrupt him if things come up. But at the end, we will also be opening it up for questions and comments. So with that, Rabbi Muller, it's all you.
Well, thank you so much. It is an absolute honor to be with you this evening. I thank the leadership team, your administrators, for inviting me to present, and I've had the honor to discuss these issues of race and racism with the teachers in your school. And truthfully, your school is unique. These educators are lifelong learners who want the best for your children. They weave the values of Judaism through really what sounds like a very rigorous academic curriculum. And they seem to constantly speak about what is best for the children, what are best for the families. And I also equally applaud each of you. I know what Zoom fatigue feels like in 2022, and it is a Sunday evening, and yet you're all joining us. So I hope that you find the next hour to be useful and insightful. And said, I'm going to look forward to any of your questions or comments. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen and show you a little about who I am. So as said, I've been the head of the Cutler Jewish Day School in Columbia, South Carolina for the past 30 years. So that's a school for preschool birth through the 5th grade. Also, I work at the university, and you could see me there with some of my students prior to COVID, so none of us were wearing masks at that time. And one of the greatest joys of my life is I'm a grandfather, and there is my granddaughter and grandson. So I can't tell you what a joy that is. I barely remember my 4 children's names anymore. I always tell them they're 1.0, and this 2.0 grandchildren thing is where I want to be always. So, and I anchor my work in the verse, justice, justice, thou shalt pursue. So I feel that the conversations we're having, we're going to have this evening are about justice. And I wanted to start with a story. This is a story about the Maasai warriors. So this is a group of people that lived in Kenya. And they are known for, or back in the day, they were very warlike. They were known for their strategies in conquering other territories, in extending their land. And they were fearsome. And yet the group had a greeting. They had a greeting that when one warrior met the other, they would always ask. And this would be if the warriors met in battle, in their town, in a bartering, a situation of buying and selling. There was one greeting. One warrior would look at another and say, Shalom Aleichem. I'm just joking. They didn't really say that. One warrior would look at another and say, and how are the children? And the traditional response was, the children are well. So think about that. Think of this people that have this warlike reputation, and yet everything was about, and how are the children? And the response that they hope to get is, and the children were well. And I always think to myself, the first time I read that, I thought, what if we lived in a society where every one of our political leaders would wake up each morning and ask, and how are the children? If every CEO of a company at a board meeting would say, and how are the children? If every newscast was concerned with, how are the children? We'd live in a different world. And through my career, I am concerned with, how are the children? And I hope you find this evening's talk to circle around that important group of people. So here is a little agenda that we're going to follow. So I'm going to provide some guidelines to how to talk about difficult topics. Tonight, it's race and racism. But these guidelines could be used for many topics. We'll talk about why we need to discuss race with young children and students, suggestions to raise race-conscious children. I'm going to offer you a picture book or two to model with, provide some strategies, and walk through a conversation. And at that time, we can unmute and I can answer any questions. But of course, as discussed, you could put any questions you want in the chat, which is being monitored, and those will be shared, and I could do my best to answer those because I look forward to this being interactive. All right, guidelines for discussions about race. So it's not easy, right? If it was easy, we'd all do it. It's a difficult topic to discuss. And I have a few pointers I'd like to share. One of them is, if you feel that like it's getting difficult and you're wanting to step back or log off or say, this isn't for me, you might be on the learning edge. The great child psychologist Jean Piaget called this in disequilibrium. Sometimes when we feel a little bit of imbalance, that we're getting ideas that don't match with the ones we have in our head, it causes us to have cognitive dissonance, a little imbalance, and we want to draw away. But that might be the best time to learn something new. Because if you retreat at that point, you might miss that opportunity. And it's helpful to know that sometimes when we talk about difficult conversations, there are emotions that go along with that. Annoyance, anger, surprise, defensiveness, and that's okay. Because I know, I've heard it from your administrators so many times, what a great group of families you are. So if one of us is feeling that, let's share it. Because it's okay, we're a community. And we're a larger Jewish community, and we have each other's backs, and we could share these things. And once again, keep in mind that we're really doing this for the children. We want our students, our children, who I understand in the school are predominantly white children, not all, but predominantly white Jewish children. We're doing it for them, and we're doing it for children of color as well. So we have both groups that we're committed to this evening and in these conversations. One other guideline I want to point out is sometimes we get triggered. I might say something that causes you almost an emotional response. One gets one's back up or tightens oneself. It feels uncomfortable. And if that happens, once again, feel free to interrupt me or put it in the chat and say, hey, that triggered me. That didn't feel good. And I'll say, tell me more about that. Because I say times a day, tell me more about that. And we could look at it, and maybe I'll need to apologize for something I said, or maybe we can come to a new understanding. So I just like to make people aware and recognize that anyone's words could trigger anyone else. So if it happens, we'll come in open-minded, with great respect, and do our best to move forwards. And it's really important to recognize that this work is not about guilt. If we make a child feel guilty about the color of their skin or their socioeconomic level, or where they live, or the language they speak, or anything about them, we failed. That would be considered a failure because we never want to make a child feel guilty. We never want to cause shame. If we in some way embarrass a child and cause shame, we have not met the mark. And nor is this about fear. We never want a person to lose their identity and heritage in shining a light on another. It's not a zero-sum game. We can be proud and Jewish and pro-Israel and everything else, and have this racial justice component in our lives. So this work for me is joyous. It's responsibility. It's a joy where we can find happiness in committing to work around issues of equity. So once again, if anything I say raises any of these terms, guilt, shame, or fear, or you're wondering how it might work, ask me, because that's the furthest and last thing we'd want to happen. Okay, and it plays into core Jewish values. That's how I see the work. The concept of B'Tselem Elokim, that we're all made in the image of God. So we want to make sure that this work is good in that. And there's a beautiful quote from the Talmud, from the Gemara, that says, come in here. Great is human dignity, as it overrides a prohibition in the Torah. So I don't tell you as a rabbi that I'm not making a halachic saying that this human dignity overrides anything, but here it is in the Talmud that says that, look how holy and important human dignity is. And Shalom Elokim. So that's sort of our foundational Jewish pieces that we're building on as I speak. So those are some of the ways that I like to frame this conversation, to frame it in a work that we're all doing together. I've had a lot of practice doing it, but you have insights that I hope to learn from this evening. Okay, so with that sort of preface and that understanding, there is a question, well, why do this with children? Why do this with elementary and middle school children and preschool children? They're so young. So I want to share a little bit of a work. Or you know what? Let me just take a minute. Sorry, Lena, I'm going off script. But let me just ask, does anyone have any questions about that? Ask.
When you spoke about not making children ever feel guilty for the way they are, I assumed you were speaking of children of color who might feel inferior or guilty for being the way they are, or were you referring to the more privileged, it's often referred to, and the CRT opponents are saying that they're opposed to critical race theory because young students, white students, are made to feel guilty for what happened in the past. So I wasn't sure which population you were referring to.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. What a fantastic question. So I am really believe that no child should be made to feel guilty about who they are. So we certainly, let's look at the population of students in the school. Most of them are white. Someone who is dabbling in this might come in and provide historical events that would make a child feel guilty about the role white people had in enslavement. That's a mistake. That is a mistake. We never want children to feel guilty. And I love your other points. I believe that starting Black history or African American history as slavery idea would be like starting Jewish history with the Holocaust. Instead, and what would that make children feel? Guilty, ashamed, why did their people suffer this? So I always start Black history with the continent of Africa and some of the wonderful things that came out of the continent. So that would be for a child of color, particularly an African American child, to not make them feel ashamed, guilty, or anything else, And also for white children, I would never want a white child to feel guilty because of the way things were in this country. So I would say both. And I thank you so much for that question.
And if I can interject too, Carol, I had a colleague who shared that there was issues with the way things were happening in their classroom, and a white child came home and said, "Mommy, I'm an oppressor." This
Mm.
was like a fourth grader, right? So that's part of what we're talking about, right? Children should not be coming home saying, "I am an oppressor," right? They can learn about the value of every life, and they can learn about history without taking on that personal sense of "I'm an oppressor" because of the color of my skin. So that's some of what we've talked about also in doing this work, our faculty and our staff, and thinking about what it means to bring it responsibly to our children.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And that was so succinct. And the point, one of the points, that no white child should ever feel guilty for events in the past. If we do that, then we've missed our mark. All right, but thank you again for that question. So let's look at some of the reasons. I want to introduce a colleague of mine, Meir Muller. We received our doctorates about the same time and worked together for a bit. Erin has 3 children. They're white as she is, and she looked at what messages they were getting through the mail. So this was a while back, a little bit ago. 2015 was when she published her first research. So there was email, but she looked at the actual paper that was coming into her children's lives. And she found that a lot of it featured white people. Now, is there anything wrong with that? Of course not. But she kept on looking and kept on marking and seeing what came. And she looked at the Scholastic Book Order, something that many schools do. And she found that when she read through each month, and you could see every single month, she looked at what percentage of the human characters were white, featured in the books that Scholastic was offering. And you could see over 84% were white characters. Now, is there something wrong with that? No. However, it does give the message that white is right, that without diversity, children might think of themselves as being the normal group and everyone else as something other. So she was looking out for that. And her study was also collaborated by this little infographic where you can see that children's books in 2018, so not long ago, 50% of the characters are white in the books. 27% are talking animals. 10% were African American, 7% Asian American, and 5% Latinx, and 1% American Indians. So I did a little research, and I asked children at the Jewish day school. I would show them books with talking animals, and I would say, if these talking animals were people, what color would their skin be? And every single child said white. Like it wasn't even a small percentage said something else. So in my mind, when we have 50% of the books as white and 27% as animals in the children, and this wasn't a national study, it was a little group of children, but they, we could assume that children are seeing mostly images of white people in books. And even if you don't accept the idea that the talking animals represent white people, we could still see that African American characters are not even half of the talking animal characters. So they're only 10%. So this Dr. Muller was looking at this and just seeing that these were the images, excuse me, that her children were receiving. And, it just didn't feel good to her. It felt that they were not getting the diverse message that she thought they were. And she self-defines as a very liberal family. They went to an integrated church, so there were all types of different people in her church and in the children's schools. And yet all of their mail, all of the catalogs and promotional materials that came to her house featured white people. And when she looked even deeper about those that came in that had Black advertisements, she found that sometimes they were stereotypical or simplified, like he had a dream, or I had a dream, where children were given a coloring sheet and they could color Dr. Martin Luther King in. So she said, that was a very simplification. You could see the Native American person is depicted and the African American barbecue sauce. And she said sometimes they were pitied. So she noticed that they got a lot of mailers asking for tzedakah, for charity, for Black and brown children. So she noted that when her children did see these images of people of color, they often were not representing in the same way that the images of the white children were. So these are things from her study. And I'd like to show you one more study. This is small, but of course, you'll get this PowerPoint if it's given out. But this is seven different research studies. So this is not just one person. This is 7 different people or groups of people showing us how even very young children have ideas about skin color. As young as 2, use race to reason about people's behavior. This is not insidious. This is not wrong. Our brains are hardwired to categorize. This was discussed by Piaget back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It is shown again in the brain research of the last 20 years. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's how we are hardwired to think by categorizing many of the experiences we have. So children as young as 2 are doing this. They're categorizing Black and white. Maybe there's a child care provider who's Black and does it differently than at home. And they're trying to make sense of this. At 30 months, children can use race to choose playmates. Once again, this is not wrong. This is not saying the child is racist. God forbid, we would never say that. The child, though, is making categories and seeing that the people mostly around them are white, and therefore will play with white children. Or the child might see most of the people around me are Black, and therefore I'd rather play with Black children or brown children, or based on the population around the child. Where it gets a little scary is when you start looking at the kindergarten level, the 5-year-olds, because they're already talking about certain groups having a higher status than other groups. So that, once again, we would never blame the child. It's the author Beverly Tatum, who wrote Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, said it's like living in Los Angeles where there's smog. You're going to breathe in smog whether you want to or not. It's just in the air. And she said in the air in our country, people do breathe in ideas about race. And therefore, these 5-year-olds are getting messages, just like Dr. Miller's children got messages, of what group is normal, so to say, and what group is not. However, the great news in the 5 to 7-year-old study, so the final one on the page, the 6+ study, is that we can change this with conversations. A week, 2 weeks of talking to children could get them removed from these ideas. So while we can see what could happen, we can also change it. And that's really why you're here tonight, to recognize that. If that wasn't the fact, it would be really, really disastrous. But we can change this dynamic by just talking to children. And we're going to move into now some of the ways that we could model and talk to children. But let me stop here for a minute and see if that brought up any questions that anyone would like to ask right now.
Rabbi, can I ask Lauren Schechter? Thank you very, very much. I was curious as to your reference to your colleague's study regarding the percentage of faces as compared to African American, Native American, et cetera. The percentages seem to be consistent or largely consistent with the US Census. How would you respond? I guess what
Sure.
would be your recommendation toward that?
Oh, first of all, thank you for that question. You're right. You're right. About 14% of our country is, we'll say, Black or African American. So yes, we would expect the mailings to most reflect white people. We would expect the Scholastic magazines to do that. So once again, there is nothing wrong. I'm not throwing shade, as they say, at Scholastic or at the things arriving in our house, but she was what, as am I, what message is it giving children to again and again mostly see white people as enjoying themselves on vacation? And I have to say it often, if we're watching news or going through social media, we see Black people sometimes represent criminals and being arrested and such. So my concern is not the percentages. I agree. That's a really excellent point. My concern is, what are our children seeing and what is that making them feel? Not suggesting that we replace our libraries in our homes or classrooms with books that only have Black children or characters in it. That's and not the way to go. But I would suggest that we make sure that we do have representations that shine a light on the greatness of all different cultures. But thank you. Wonderful question. Okay. So let's go a little bit further, and then of course there'll be more time for questions. So when I think of, like, what's our goal? What is our goal? And going, it does relate to Mr. Schechter's question. So, or doctor, sorry, relates to the question. So my goal is to allow children to normalize and celebrate other people's ways of being. So I suggest, if we want to raise children to really honor all the different people, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. So we need to become accustomed to discussing issues of race that normalize and celebrate people's ways of being. And I do think it's worth mentioning that our Jewish community is anywhere from 6 to 15% people of color. Most of the number is 12%. That's if you read this research. They always say about 12% of Jews are people of color. So let's say we could use that. However, I've seen sources as small as 6 and as large as 15, but let's say it's 12%. So we want to make sure that is normalized for our children, that they recognize, step one, Jewish people come in different shades of skin. And even when we move outside of the Jewish community, to recognize that that all groups of people have wonderful things. So that's one, normalize, celebrate. The next is that we need to model behaviors. So if we want children to normalize and celebrate, we have to be intentional, have kavanah. There's no way that this is just gonna happen. So if we're saying to children it's important to have a diverse group of friends, but children don't see diversity in our lives, as far as our adult friends, then it's hard for them to make it a priority. However, we have to be real. We might live and work in neighborhoods where there's not diversity. So it might not be possible. So then we have to be really mindful of the media that children consume and the books and toys that we choose, because it might not be able to be in our social circles, but we can make sure that we are pointing out to children some of the great resources or books and other items. When my granddaughter was newborn, I bought her lots of books, and many of them featured African American characters. I bought her lots of dolls because she was the first. Bought her lots of everything. But she had a doll that had brown skin and a doll that had white skin because I wanted to normalize it for her. I knew in her preschool or infant center she would probably not see children of color, so I made it an intent of buying her both, of course. And sometimes we need to create situations where a child can meet people of diverse racial backgrounds. So it could be that we take children, prior to COVID or after COVID to a lecture or an event that highlights a Black person. And I would say that we should try to find something scholarly. So I recognize that children have a wide array of Black musicians and sports figures that they might know. But let's try to broaden that circle for children so they can see Black scientists and politicians and so on and so forth. So that's sort of modeling those behaviors, either looking at people in our own lives that we're inviting over that our children are seeing. If not, can we be intentional to the events they go to, the television they watch, and the toys and books that they read? And then we can empower children. They could pursue justice. Children throughout Jewish history, the holiday of Purim about to come up has a explanation of how the children led the way by learning Torah to thwart the wicked decrees and such. And we have children leading the way in many Jewish episodes. So we know that children could do things as well. They could protest, they could write letters, they could, depending on the event, do tremendous amounts of activism. And I could give you plenty of examples if you like, but these are three things to think about our own children, to keep the big idea of normalizing and celebrating race, to the opportunities we have, and even to take the next step of children pursuing justice, as the Torah says.
If I can just jump in and interject one thing before you move on as well, which is that in a pre-pandemic world, we had a relationship with a local Muslim school and a Catholic school. And we are looking to renew that relationship once we can get back together. And it was a really important experience for our kids, not just in terms of exposure to interfaith, but racial diversity was a part of that as well. And for many of our kids, it was the first time that they had interacted with people of color. And it was a positive experience, again, just to the word normalizing. Oh, they're just kids like us. They're just kids like us. So to have those experiences can be just really important and powerful towards that end of normalizing and valuing and just having a personal experience.
Without question, that's really the goal, to normalize, to celebrate, shine a light on all the different cultures within and outside of Judaism. All right. And let me show you a book or two as examples. So this is a lovely book for younger children called Full of Love, or Full of Love. And it's a book about a Sunday night dinner at Grandma's house. So it starts, Grandma's house full of hugs and kisses, full of tasty dishes, full of kinds of fishes, full to the brim with happy faces, full of love. That's Sunday at Granny's house. And the book goes on, and the child wants to eat, but they have to wait for all the relatives to come. And then the best of my memory, there's a little prayer before dinner, and then they pass around the food, and at the end, the child is exhausted and falls asleep, or he helps clean up and then falls asleep. And I use this as a normalizing text. And I ask children, what does this remind you? What are the similarities and differences between Shabbat dinner and this? And the children have all the connections. They make so many great connections between this and a Shabbat dinner, and what's different and what's the same, or a Thanksgiving dinner, or a family dinner. You know, you could use any example, but as I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to say Lena, if you go by your first name. Okay,
Lena.
so as Lena just said, it's all about that normalizing. Just, hey, look at this. There are similarities there. And yes, there are differences too, but this book is beautiful for our preschoolers, early elementary children, to bring up some of these differences, some of these similarities, to normalize the different customs of people. Here are some others. I want to do a disclaimer. I have not read Color Me In. That's a young adult novel about a Jewish young woman, or a young adult who has a parent who's Jewish, a parent who's African American. So I have not read that. I've heard good things, but I haven't read it. So I wanted to put that out. But here you see books that are at an intersection between Judaism and our African American community. So As Good as Anybody, the famous book of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Marching with Dr. King, and once again showing the similarities between Rabbi Heschel's experiences growing up under oppression and Dr. Martin Luther King's experiences of the same. A lovely book, It's Challah Time, for young children, where it just has a very diverse set of characters. This is the 20th anniversary edition, so they've updated the pictures to include diverse children in that book. There are books in Hebrew and Spanish, and Stealing Home is another one I'm not as familiar with. I believe it's about for young adults, so for middle schoolers, about a child who also has a side of his family who are in the Black community and a side of his family in the Jewish community, and how he finds baseball to bring those two sides together. I think he lives in one part of New York first, and he loves the Yankees, and then he moves to Brooklyn with his Jewish side of his family, and he has to cheer for the Brooklyn Dodgers and all of the angst that causes. But these are books that can be read with a child or offered to a child. I'd always suggest you read it first, make sure it's suitable for your family, but can model these types of conversations and raise questions and introduce the topic. Then there are hard books. These books raise difficult questions. So I'm putting that out there. I'm not suggesting you read these to your children without reading them first and making sure they work for your family. One that in my top left-hand corner, I'm looking at Milo's Museum. I think that's a book that everyone, I believe everyone could comfortably read. It's a little girl goes to a museum and doesn't see herself represented, doesn't see that any pictures that represent African American people or people of color, and she starts asking questions of how do things land in a museum or are placed in a museum? What's a curator? What's a docent? So the children get some vocabulary around a museum, and then when she doesn't see what I would refer to as a window, a mirror, she doesn't see herself reflected, she makes her own museum in the backyard of her home, and she invites all the guests in. And I think that the idea of mirrors and windows is another tool you could use. Like, do our children have plenty of mirrors? Do they see your family's skin color represented, their Jewish religion represented? We want to make sure there are plenty of mirrors for children to see themselves and to feel good about themselves. So if they go to a museum and there's nothing Jewish in that museum, that's problematic. And we'd want to make sure they had a mirror to see themselves. And children also need windows. They need the ability to see other cultures. So in Milo's museum, she doesn't see, she has windows, she sees other cultures, but she doesn't see herself, so she takes action. So that's a book that I think people would find useful, perhaps. But I will tell you that the one in the middle, Mama, Did You Hear the News? That is a book that one would need to read first. I'll share a few pages of that. Mama, did you hear the news? Another man was shot. They say he had a little girl. Bet he misses him a lot. I know you boys are youngsters, but life goes fast, you see. I want to share this with you, words your granny shared with me. A to the L to the IVE. A to the L to the IVE. Come home alive, that is the key. A, always use your manners. Always use your manners. Yes, sir. No, sir. Be polite. No attitude and never talk back. Be respectful day and night. And the book, I'm picking this up in the middle of the book, but it is about the murder of an unarmed African American, and the book goes through the children processing this event with the parents and the famous talk that African American families often have with their children. And here we see on the first page I read to you, it's generational. So this father had to talk with his mother, and now he's having this same talk with his children. So that's the book pictured in the middle here. Mama, Did You Hear the News? And it is something that we need to really think about, and I recommend it. But obviously, families need to think about these concepts first. The other books you see here are Daddy, There's a Noise Outside. That one's a little less direct. The children ask what a protest is, and the father and mother explain to the child what a protest is. Something Happened in Our Town is a book, again, about a shooting of an unarmed civilian, and it's told from the points of view from a white family and a black family looking at the same event. It's a bit older children, and also respectful of each culture. It doesn't slam one culture or the other. It's very respectful, and that was written on these topics. And a book that's newer to me is not my idea. It's more of a similar to a graphic novel, although not exactly. Also on this topic. I don't know that one as well, but I do own it. So there are ways to jump into these with children using books. So I just wanted to share some of those with you so that you can go. And now I'm going to jump into having the actual conversation. There's only really 2 slides left, so I'll just give you an idea. It's not death by PowerPoint. So I have about 2 slides left, although this one I'm going to run through twice with you, and then we'll have time just for me to answer any questions you have. But this is how I would do this. So I present you with these ideas. To one, okay, so I'm getting ready to have a conversation about race with a child. So I have to collect myself first. And I always, before I enter these conversations, if I have the opportunity, I think to myself, okay, what is my goal? I want to promote justice, counter racism if it comes up. That's my goal, promote justice. Okay. Present for the child, I am going to turn off my cell phone. That's a big step, but it's necessary. This is an important conversation, and this is the talk I give myself. I'm going to turn off my cell phone, move away from the computer, and try absolutely present for this conversation. Next, I'm going to validate. I'm going to tell the child, This is an important conversation. I'm so thankful that you're having it with me. So I'm validating that in. And I'm asking the child, tell me everything. Tell me what you're thinking. I let the child talk. I let a moment of silence. I say, do you want to tell me more about that? Is there anything else? I give wait time. I count in my head up to 10 seconds of just silence. So maybe there's something else the child wants to share. Then I lean into the conversation. I try to keep my goals in mind. This is about justice. I don't let myself off easy. I want to have this conversation. And I do something I learned from Mr. Rogers when I was a little boy. I point out the good work being done, because no matter what the situation is, often there's someone doing good work. So I will point that out to the child. And then, depending on how the conversation goes, I'll think of an action that I might do with the child, especially if the child is my own child. What action can we take? And then later on, I'll circle back. So let's try this together. Let's try this. So I'm going to use a scenario that happened in school, in my school. I'd spoken to a parent who wanted me to speak to their child about a question. The child had asked the parent, is it true that a police officer murdered a man named George Floyd? Did the police kill him? And while I'm not going to role play it tonight, the child's exact question was, is it true that the police officer murdered a man named Floyd because he was black? Now that's a harder question, but let's try this once together. Is it, I'm sorry. Whoops, my apologies. Is it true that the police murdered a man who didn't have a gun? His name was George Floyd? Okay, so I keep my goals in mind. I turn off my cell phone. I don't let anything interrupt, and I validate the child. Thank you for asking this question. It's a really important question. Tell me, what have you heard? Well, my friend told me, or on a Zoom class I heard, or I read it on social media. I read the police killed this man. I wait. I give wait time. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me about this? Did you hear anything else? Then I lean into the conversation, because I will tell you, even after all these years that I've been working on this topic, I still have something inside that wants me to put the child's mind at rest and say, there is a few bad apples out there. And one of those bad police officers killed George Floyd. But I don't believe it anymore. I do believe that there are many good police officers, but I would lean in and say, I have to tell you, my understanding is that yes, a policeman did kill George Floyd, and he didn't need to die. Sometimes some police do not treat black people fairly. So I would lean in and say that to the child, that yes, it's true that sometimes some officers do not treat black people fairly, and George Floyd was murdered. And then I go right into pointing out good work being done. But let me tell you that people are upset about this, and there are protests, and throughout Jewish history, Jewish people have been on the forefront of protesting when things aren't fair. It's part of who we are, and we're doing that again. And I could ask the child, depending on his or her age, would you like to write a letter or send a letter to George Floyd's parents or his family? Or would you like to write a letter to our mayor about your thoughts on this? or our police chief. So there could be action that the child will feel is healing to be done. And then I'll ask the child, is there anything else you want to share? And if the child says no, which often at that point that was a lot of information, I'll make a mental note to circle back a week later and say, hey, I'm still thinking about that conversation. Is there anything else that you've heard since then, or anything else you want to talk about? And that's how I have a difficult conversation with children. Those are the steps I take. Unfortunately, I've had to use these steps too many times. I used them when people were murdered in Pittsburgh in the synagogue, when children are killed in schools, when at the Emmanuel line, when Black people were killed here in South Carolina in a church. So I'm coming back to having these conversations, and I wanted to share with you this evening how to do them. Once again, it's really all based on this idea of B'Tselem Elokim and human dignity. This rabbi tells us human dignity is so precious. There's nothing that God loves more. There's nothing more about it. So I'm going to stop here. I know we have about 8 to 10 minutes left, and I'll take any questions or comments anyone has.
There was a question in the chat about a book, if you're familiar with Julius Lester's book, Let's Talk About Race.
Yes, so is that fascinating? Julia Lester, who self-defines as a Jewish person and is African American, did write that book. So I don't know it well enough to comment on it, but it brings up positive connotations in my mind. But I wouldn't want to say anything particular about it because I haven't read it in a while. But I believe it is another thought. Oh yes, it's a lovely book.
You want to unmute so you can
Okay.
share?
At the beginning of the pandemic, I since I wasn't spending money on anything, I ordered a lot of books for my children's book collection, even though I'm own. And this is one that I ordered. And I actually read it with my children and my grandchildren. We had quite a discussion about the whole idea is like, if we took off our skin, like he has, you feel your bones here and your bones here, and we all have the same bones. And therefore, if we took off, we're really all the, and my family is quite diverse. We've had a lot of mixing of cultures and religions. And so it was really interested to hear the response of my kids. And they felt that they don't like that idea that we're all the same, because we're not all the same. And that this book doesn't acknowledge that, you know, in a way that was comfortable for them. But I kind of liked it. You know, at the end, it's like, I'll take my skin off if you take your skin off, and then
so I think that there is that always tug to look at the similarities that we have, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we also don't want to be colorblind and not see color. I think that our individual, I don't want anyone not to see my Judaism. I'm really proud about my Judaism that make me unique. So I think that message is half the message, and the other half is that, yes, there are beautiful things about my skin color and who I am that bring up cultural differences that I want people to be aware of. So yeah, it's a great half.
yeah, it was a good discussion. But the consensus was get rid of it. But
and sometimes that's the consensus. Other thoughts or questions?
if anybody wants it, let me know.
Okay.
No, I also was attracted to it because the author was Jewish, and
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Other questions or thoughts?
Hi. Before we came to Schechter, we have young kids. We went to a secular, racially diverse preschool, you know, and the kids, they just all play together. No issues whatsoever. Is this something that we should have brought attention to, or just let them be?
I think you could let them be. I think if you already you had an environment where children were playing together, and you know, at the young ages of preschool, 2-3-year-olds, you could let them be perhaps as they're entering 4 and well, yes, you could let them be, but if a child naturally would say, my granddaughter in the store said, hey, look, that man has brown skin. Ooh, isn't that? We all feel that happening. And I said, you're right, Rosie. That man does have brown skin. All of our skin colors are so beautiful. Hashem loves them all. So God loves them all. So I think that there was that, yes, we let the children play, but as they're getting a little older, we might introduce a book or that will enable us to broaden the conversation about the great cultures in the world, and point out teachers who are also African American. A lot of work I do is on anti-Semitism, but there's also issues of sexism. Our children often do not see female scientists and female mathematicians, so I like to point that out. So we're just celebrating and normalizing all the ways of being. So I hope that answers the question. I want to thank you for the opportunity. It was wonderful to learn with you and to talk, and I love the points that were made, and I thank you for sharing an hour with me this evening.
And Rabbi Muller, I want to thank you so much for being with us, for guiding us in how to think about this and seeing the challenges in considering some of the different aspects, but really giving some guidelines for us as parents, as grandparents, as educators. So Dara, and thanks to everyone else for showing up on this evening to learn together. And I want to wish everyone Laila Tov, have a great night, and thank you all so much for being with us. Take care.
Bye-bye.